The smallest act of kindness can awaken a kingdom that has been sleeping in silence. The rain had started before sunset and showed no intention of stopping. Cold water rolled down cracked storefront windows, pooled along broken sidewalks, and turned the narrow streets of downtown Portland into rivers of blurred neon reflections. Charlotte Hayes adjusted the paper bag tucked carefully beneath her jacket and hurried toward the bus stop, her shoes splashing through shallow puddles. The bag carried the last meal she had bought for herself that day, a simple turkey sandwich, a bruised apple, and a small carton of milk. It wasn't much, but after a double shift at the neighborhood diner, it was all she could afford until payday. Her stomach tightened with hunger as the smell drifted through the paper. Rent was late again. Her landlord had already left 2 warning notices. The old sedan she depended on had broken down 3 weeks earlier, forcing her to ride buses across the city. Even so, she still managed to smile at customers who barely noticed she existed. Inside the diner, everyone called her dependable. Outside those doors, the city barely remembered her name. Less than half a mile away, something far older than the city itself was unfolding beneath layers of steel and stone. But Charlotte knew nothing about that. She only knew the cold was getting worse. As she approached the covered bus shelter, she noticed someone sitting alone on the far end of the bench. The man wore an old charcoal coat soaked by the rain. His dark hair clung to his forehead, and his hands rested motionless in his lap. From a distance he looked exhausted, almost ill. Several commuters walked past him without slowing down. One man frowned before choosing another bench farther away. A teenager glanced toward him, shook his head, and disappeared onto the arriving bus. Within minutes, the shelter emptied until only Charlotte and the stranger remained beneath the flickering overhead light. She hesitated. She was tired, hungry. Her bus would arrive in 6 minutes. She looked at the paper bag in her hands, then back at the stranger. His face was unusually pale, almost colorless beneath the dim light, yet there was nothing frightening about him, only a quiet loneliness that reminded her of people she had seen waiting outside emergency rooms with nowhere else to go. She stepped closer. "Excuse me. Are you okay?" The man slowly lifted his head. His gray eyes settled on her with surprising calm. They weren't pleading for help. They simply looked empty. "I'm fine," he answered. His voice was smooth but strangely distant, as though every word carried the weight of countless sleepless nights. Charlotte glanced at the untouched vending machine across the sidewalk before looking back at the sandwich inside her bag. She smiled apologetically. "You don't really sound fine." He said nothing. Rain continued tapping against the shelter roof while passing headlights painted silver ribbons across the pavement. Charlotte exhaled quietly before placing the paper bag beside him. "I was saving this for dinner," she admitted with an embarrassed laugh. "But I think you need it more than I do." The stranger looked at the bag without reaching for it. "You should keep it. I'll figure something out." She shrugged. "People have helped me before. Seems fair to return the favor." For the first time, something almost invisible shifted across his expression. Not a smile, not surprise, recognition, as though he had heard forgotten words spoken again after centuries of silence. Charlotte checked the digital sign. Her bus was pulling around the corner. "Promise me one thing," she added. "Eat while it's still warm." She stepped backward just as the bus stopped beside the curb. The doors opened with a hiss. She climbed aboard, paid her fare, and found a seat beside the rain-streaked window. As the bus pulled away, she glanced back toward the shelter. The stranger still hadn't opened the bag. Instead, he was watching the departing bus with an unreadable expression, holding the meal as carefully as though it was something infinitely more valuable than food. Charlotte looked away, assuming she would never see him again. Unfortunately for her, she had just offered her last meal to the one man hundreds of vampires had been searching for across the country, and before sunrise, the quiet street where no one had noticed her kindness would become the center of a gathering no ordinary human had witnessed in hundreds of years. Charlotte Hayes reached her apartment a little after 9 that night. The building was old enough to remember better days, with chipped paint along the stair railings and a hallway that always smelled faintly of dust and coffee. She unlocked the door to her tiny studio, flipped on the single lamp beside the window, and stood still for a moment as silence settled around her. The room felt even smaller without dinner waiting on the table. She filled a glass with tap water, sliced the apple she had planned to save for breakfast, and laughed softly at herself. Somehow, giving away the sandwich had made the empty room feel less lonely. Outside, rain continued falling against the fire escape, creating a steady rhythm that almost sounded comforting. Across the city, however, that same rain washed across the roofs of abandoned warehouses near the river, where dozens of black vehicles arrived without headlights. Their engines stopped one after another until the only sound remaining was the rain itself. Men and women stepped out wearing tailored dark coats that looked untouched by the weather. They spoke quietly, their movements precise, their eyes fixed on the same destination. At the center of the gathering stood an elderly man with silver hair and a calm expression that carried unmistakable authority. He accepted a folded paper bag from a younger attendant with unusual care. Inside rested an untouched turkey sandwich, a bruised apple, and an unopened carton of milk. No one questioned why such ordinary items had been placed inside a polished wooden case lined with velvet. Every face present understood their importance without explanation. Less than 12 hours earlier, the man who possessed the highest authority among them had accepted food from a human for the first time in more than 2 centuries. None of them remembered that ever happening before. Charlotte knew nothing about any of this. She spent the next morning rushing back to the diner before sunrise. The breakfast crowd poured through the doors in steady waves. Coffee machines hissed constantly while plates clattered across the kitchen pass. She greeted every customer with the same warm smile, even when most barely looked up from their phones. Around 10 o'clock, her manager handed her another tray. Table 14 had requested extra coffee. Charlotte balanced the mugs carefully and crossed the dining room. An older customer noticed the small bandage wrapped around her finger from the previous week and smiled kindly. "You always seem cheerful," he said. "I try," Charlotte answered with a quiet laugh. "Somebody has to make Mondays a little easier." She returned to work without realizing someone near the front window had been watching her for nearly 20 minutes. The same pale stranger from the bus shelter sat alone inside a parked black sedan across the street. He wore a clean charcoal suit instead of the soaked coat from the previous evening, but his expression remained just as calm. He watched Charlotte greet impatient customers, help an elderly woman carry her takeout bag, and kneel beside a little boy to return the toy car he had dropped beneath a booth. Every small kindness seemed completely natural to her, never performed for recognition. The stranger quietly closed his eyes for a brief moment before speaking to the driver. She expected nothing in return. The driver lowered his head respectfully. "No, Your Majesty. Did anyone approach her?" "No, we followed your command exactly." The stranger looked back toward the diner window. Charlotte laughed at something one of the cooks shouted from the kitchen. She had no idea anyone was watching. "Keep it that way," he replied. She must continue living exactly as she has. The sedan pulled away before Charlotte ever glanced outside. Later that afternoon, as her shift finally ended, she stepped onto the sidewalk carrying her worn backpack. The rain had disappeared, leaving bright sunlight reflecting across fresh puddles. Everything appeared completely ordinary until she noticed something unusual waiting beside the diner entrance. A simple paper bag rested on the bench where customers usually waited for rides. Attached to the handle was a handwritten note with only 6 words. "Kindness is never forgotten. Eat well today." Charlotte looked around in confusion. There was no signature. Inside the bag she found a warm homemade meal, fresh fruit, and a small loaf of artisan bread that still carried the scent of a nearby bakery. She smiled, assuming an anonymous customer had decided to repay yesterday's generosity. What she did not know was that hundreds of silent eyes had been watching from rooftops, parked cars, and distant windows all day long, awaiting a single order that had not yet been given. Charlotte Hayes carried the anonymous meal home that evening without telling anyone about the note. She assumed one of the regular customers had quietly decided to repay a favor, and that explanation felt far more reasonable than any other possibility. The warm bread filled her apartment with a comforting smell that reminded her of family dinners she had not experienced in years. She carefully folded the handwritten note and tucked it inside an old recipe book before going to sleep, never imagining that someone had already memorized the exact place where she hid it. The following morning, the city woke beneath clear blue skies. Sunlight reflected from the river while delivery trucks crowded the streets and office workers hurried toward another ordinary Tuesday. Charlotte unlocked the side entrance of the diner just before dawn and began arranging coffee cups before the first customers arrived. The familiar routine steadied her mind. Fresh coffee brewed, bacon sizzled across the grill. The radio played old country songs low enough that conversations could still fill the room. Nothing about the morning suggested her life had quietly become the center of an invisible storm. Less than 2 miles away, Inside the highest floor of an unmarked office building, the pale stranger stood beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. His name was Rafael Morello, although almost no human alive had ever spoken it. Around a polished conference table, more than 20 elegantly dressed figures waited in complete silence. None of them sat before he did. One advisor finally stepped forward carrying a leather folder. "The surveillance reports are complete, Your Majesty." Raphael accepted the folder without opening it. "Has she accepted any gifts beyond the meal?" "No." "Has anyone approached her directly?" "No." He nodded once. "Good." The advisor hesitated. "Many houses believe the debt should already be acknowledged." Raphael turned toward the skyline instead of answering immediately. The morning light softened his impossibly pale features, yet his expression remained unreadable. "Kindness offered without expectation cannot be repaid with spectacle," he said quietly. "Not yet." The room fell silent again. Every vampire present understood the conversation had ended. Back at the diner, Charlotte noticed an elderly customer struggling to carry 2 heavy grocery bags after finishing breakfast. Before anyone else reacted, she stepped around the counter and offered to help him reach the bus stop across the street. He thanked her 3 different times before climbing aboard. When she returned, her manager smiled. "You know you do not have to rescue everybody." Charlotte laughed. "I am pretty sure carrying groceries does not count as a rescue." Neither of them noticed the black sedan parked half a block away. Inside, Raphael watched through the windshield as Charlotte hurried back into the diner with the same easy smile she had offered the stranger at the bus shelter. There was no performance in her kindness, no audience she hoped to impress, only habit. That was what unsettled him most. Centuries had taught him to recognize generosity that expected reward. This was different. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, a sudden summer shower swept across downtown. Customers rushed indoors, filling every booth within minutes. Charlotte balanced 3 plates across one arm while refilling coffee with the other. The rush finally slowed just before closing time. She wiped the last table near the window and looked outside. Across the street, she caught a brief glimpse of the same pale man she had helped 2 nights earlier. He stood beneath the awning of a bookstore, perfectly still despite the rain. Their eyes met for only a heartbeat. Charlotte smiled politely and gave a small wave. Raphael answered with the slightest nod before disappearing into the crowd almost immediately. By the time Charlotte stepped outside, he was gone. She looked around, puzzled that someone could vanish so quickly on a busy sidewalk. What she did not see were dozens of quiet observers blending naturally into the evening crowd, each confirming through discreet earpieces that their king had chosen to reveal himself for only a single moment, and that the first meeting Charlotte believed was ending had in truth only just begun. Charlotte Hayes slipped the handwritten note back into her recipe book before leaving for work the next morning, but she found herself thinking about it during the entire bus ride. The message had been simple, almost ordinary, yet something about the careful handwriting lingered in her mind. She had spent years believing kindness disappeared the moment it was given, carried away by strangers who rarely looked back. Now, for the first time in a long while, it seemed as though one small decision had quietly echoed somewhere beyond her understanding. The diner was unusually calm that afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the front windows, painting warm rectangles across the polished floor while only a handful of customers occupied the booths. Charlotte welcomed the slower pace. She wiped down empty tables, refilled sugar containers, and joked with the cook about the weather finally deciding to cooperate. Life felt wonderfully predictable again. Across town, predictability had become impossible. Inside an elegant stone mansion hidden behind towering cedar trees, representatives from dozens of vampire houses stood beneath crystal chandeliers that had illuminated the same hall for generations. No voices rose above a respectful whisper. Every conversation ended the instant Raphael Morello entered the room. He moved without hurry, his charcoal suit perfectly tailored, his pale expression unreadable as always. An elderly council member stepped forward. "Your Majesty, the houses grow restless. They have traveled from across the continent after hearing the reports." Raphael looked across the gathered faces. "The reports are incomplete. Then allow us to meet the human." "No." The single word settled over the room with calm finality. No one argued immediately. Finally, another council member lowered his head. "Forgive me, but many believe such compassion cannot be ordinary." Raphael's gaze shifted toward the rain-speckled windows. "Perhaps it is ordinary," he answered quietly. "Perhaps we simply forgot what ordinary kindness looks like." Silence followed. No one had expected that answer. Meanwhile, Charlotte finished her shift just before sunset and decided to stop by a neighborhood grocery store before heading home. She wandered slowly through the produce section, comparing prices as carefully as always. She smiled at an elderly cashier she recognized from previous visits and selected only what she truly needed. As she reached the checkout lane, she noticed a young mother standing ahead of her, searching through an almost empty wallet, while a little girl held a carton of milk against her chest. The mother quietly apologized to the cashier and began removing a few groceries from the conveyor belt. Without hesitation, Charlotte stepped forward. "Please let me cover the difference," she said gently. The woman immediately shook her head. "I cannot ask you to do that." "You did not ask," Charlotte smiled. "Sometimes people simply help." The cashier finished scanning the items, and within moments the family left with grateful smiles and a promise to pay the kindness forward someday. Charlotte thought nothing more of it. She gathered her own groceries and walked into the cool evening air. Less than a block away, inside another parked black sedan, two silent observers watched the entire exchange through lightly tinted windows. One reached for a small radio before stopping as the other quietly lowered his hand. "The king instructed us to observe only, he nothing else." They continued watching as Charlotte disappeared down the sidewalk beneath rows of glowing streetlights. She never once looked over her shoulder. Later that night, Raphael stood alone on the balcony of the Cedar Estate, overlooking the quiet forest beyond the city lights. A trusted advisor approached carefully. "She helped another stranger today." Raphael nodded as though he had expected nothing less. "Did she know anyone was watching?" "No, Your Majesty." A faint breeze stirred the trees below. "Good. The truest measure of character is what survives without an audience." The advisor hesitated before asking one final question. "How much longer will we remain hidden?" Raphael rested one hand against the cold stone railing without taking his eyes from the horizon. "Until revealing ourselves protects her instead of frightening her." Neither of them noticed that, far beyond the mansion gates, a lone figure had quietly photographed one of the arriving black vehicles before disappearing into the darkness. Somewhere outside the invisible world Charlotte could not yet see, someone else had begun asking questions, and the answers would bring both worlds closer together than anyone expected. Charlotte Hayes spent the next few days convincing herself that life had finally returned to normal. Morning buses arrived late as always. The diner filled with construction workers before sunrise and office employees by 8 o'clock. She memorized familiar coffee orders, smiled at regular customers, and quietly added the mysterious handwritten note to the growing collection of small reminders she kept inside her recipe book whenever the world seemed heavier than usual. She never spoke about the stranger again because there was nothing unusual to tell. She had shared a meal with someone who looked hungry. Someone had anonymously returned the kindness. The story should have ended there. Unfortunately for Charlotte, it had only begun. Across the city, preparations continued behind doors no ordinary person knew existed. The Cedar Estate remained unusually active as elegant black vehicles arrived throughout the day carrying respected representatives from ancient vampire families. None of them questioned Rafael Morello's authority, yet many struggled to understand his silence. They expected a formal declaration, a ceremonial acknowledgement, perhaps even a celebration honoring the human whose compassion had reached their king. Instead, Raphael postponed every request with calm consistency. One elder remarked during a private meeting. "Then she shall receive gratitude," Raphael answered, "not curiosity. The houses only wish to see her." Raphael slowly closed the ancient leather journal resting before him. "That is precisely what I will not allow." The discussion ended there. His decisions rarely required further explanation. Meanwhile, Charlotte accepted an extra evening shift after one of her co-workers called in sick. The diner stayed busy until almost closing time. Just before 10 o'clock, an elderly veteran entered, carrying a worn backpack, and quietly admitted he had misplaced his wallet somewhere downtown. Without waiting for instructions, Charlotte prepared a bowl of hot soup and a sandwich, then placed them on the counter with a warm smile. "You can settle the bill another day," she said. The man looked embarrassed. "I do not know if I will ever find that wallet. Then consider tonight a good reminder that tomorrow might surprise you." He thanked her several times before leaving, with genuine relief written across his face. Her manager watched the exchange from across the room, but said nothing until the customer disappeared outside. "You know the owner might ask about unpaid meals." Charlotte smiled while drying another coffee mug. "If he does, I will cover it from my paycheck." Unknown to either of them, another pair of silent observers had witnessed everything from a parked delivery van across the street. One quietly recorded the time and location inside a small notebook before closing it with obvious respect. They did not intervene, they only watched, exactly as instructed. Near midnight, Charlotte locked the diner entrance and stepped into the cool night air. Downtown Portland had grown unusually quiet. Streetlights reflected across damp pavement while a gentle breeze carried the scent of cedar from the nearby parks. As she waited for the last bus, she noticed a familiar black sedan parked farther down the block. It remained perfectly still with its headlights off. Before she could decide whether she recognized the vehicle, the rear passenger door opened. Raphael stepped onto the sidewalk, wearing the same understated charcoal suit she had glimpsed outside the bookstore. He did not approach immediately. Instead, he stopped several yards away, giving her enough space to feel comfortable. Charlotte offered the same polite smile she would have given any stranger. "You look much better than the last time I saw you." A faint warmth touched Raphael's otherwise reserved expression. "That is because of you." Charlotte laughed softly. "I only shared a sandwich. Sometimes the value of a gift cannot be measured by its size." The words sounded sincere rather than dramatic. Before she could answer, the distant sound of her approaching bus echoed around the empty intersection. She glanced toward the headlights, then back at Raphael. "I am glad you are doing well," she said. "Take care of yourself." He inclined his head respectfully. "And you, Miss Hayes." Charlotte paused for the briefest moment. She had never introduced herself. The bus pulled to the curb before she could ask how he knew her name. By the time she climbed aboard and turned toward the window, the black sedan was already pulling away into the quiet streets, leaving her with one simple question that lingered all the way home. She could not explain how a stranger knew who she was, and somewhere beyond the glow of the city lights, Raphael realized that the first thread connecting their two worlds had finally become impossible to ignore. Charlotte Hayes could not stop thinking about the stranger who somehow knew her name. The question stayed with her through another long workday, through another crowded bus ride, and even as she stood at the tiny kitchen sink washing the last dish before bed, she replayed the brief conversation over and over. Perhaps one of the regular customers had mentioned her name while he was nearby. Perhaps he had seen the embroidered name tag on her uniform during one of her shifts. Each explanation sounded reasonable for a few moments before quietly falling apart. Something still did not fit. She eventually closed her recipe book, turned off the lamp beside her bed, and promised herself she would stop worrying about someone she barely knew. Morning arrived with bright sunshine and unusually warm weather. Downtown Portland buzzed with tourists, musicians, and weekend shoppers. The sidewalks were alive with conversations, bicycles, and the smell of roasted coffee drifting from every corner cafe. Charlotte volunteered to work the lunch shift because another server needed the afternoon off. By noon, the diner was completely full. Orders arrived faster than the kitchen could prepare them, yet she moved from table to table with the same calm smile that had become part of who she was. She noticed a little girl trying to reach a dropped crayon beneath a booth and quietly retrieved it before carrying another tray across the dining room. She refilled coffee for an elderly couple without being asked because she remembered they always stayed long enough for a second cup. Every gesture was small, every gesture was genuine. Less than a mile away, Raphael Morello stood inside a quiet private library lined with shelves that stretched toward an impossibly high ceiling. Ancient books rested beside modern legal documents, reminding every visitor that two very different worlds had existed together far longer than anyone imagined. An advisor entered carrying another report. "She continues exactly as before," he said respectfully. Raphael accepted the folder but did not immediately open it. "Has anyone attempted to approach her against my orders?" "No, Your Majesty. The houses remain disciplined." The advisor hesitated before continuing. "However, many are beginning to ask the same question." Raphael finally looked up. "Which question? Why her?" Raphael walked toward one of the tall windows overlooking the cedar forest. Sunlight filtered through the branches, filling the room with soft golden light. "Because compassion given freely has become rare," he answered quietly. "When something rare deserves protection before celebration." The advisor lowered his head. "Then we shall continue waiting." Raphael nodded once. "Waiting has preserved our people for centuries." Later that afternoon, Charlotte finished her shift and decided to visit the small neighborhood bookstore she enjoyed whenever she had a free hour. The owner greeted her warmly and pointed toward a newly arrived shelf of second-hand cookbooks. She smiled with genuine excitement and slowly flipped through worn pages filled with handwritten family recipes from strangers she would never meet. While comparing two inexpensive books, she noticed someone standing several aisles away. It was Raphael. This time he was dressed casually in a dark jacket instead of a formal suit, making him appear almost ordinary among the other customers. Their eyes met for only a moment before he politely nodded. Charlotte walked toward him with quiet curiosity. "I guess we keep running into each other." A faint smile appeared. "Cities are sometimes smaller than they seem," she laughed softly. "That is one explanation." Raphael glanced toward the cookbook in her hands. "You enjoy cooking. I am still learning." She smiled. "Most of my recipes come from trial and error. The best ones often do." There was an easy calmness in the conversation that surprised her. He never asked personal questions. He never stood too close. He simply listened. Before either of them could continue, Raphael's phone vibrated once. He glanced briefly at the screen, and the warmth in his expression became thoughtful. "I have to leave." Charlotte nodded. "Maybe next time we will actually exchange names." Raphael looked at her for a quiet moment before answering. "Soon." He gently placed a small cookbook back onto the shelf that Charlotte had been considering. "I think that one suits you better." Then he walked toward the exit with the same quiet confidence he always seemed to carry. Charlotte picked up the recommended book out of curiosity. Tucked inside the front cover was a faded handwritten quote from decades earlier. "Kindness feeds the soul long before it feeds the body." She looked up immediately, but Raphael had already disappeared into the afternoon crowd, leaving her with the growing feeling that every unexpected meeting between them was somehow happening for a reason she still could not see. Charlotte Hayes left the bookstore with the second-hand cookbook tucked carefully beneath her arm, but the handwritten sentence inside refused to leave her thoughts. She had opened hundreds of used books over the years, yet none had ever seemed to arrive at exactly the right moment. As she walked toward the bus stop, she glanced back once, wondering if she might catch another glimpse of Raphael. The sidewalk was crowded with families, students, and tourists enjoying the warm afternoon, but he was nowhere to be seen. It was as though he had simply dissolved into the rhythm of the city. She smiled at the thought, boarded her bus, and convinced herself that coincidence was still the simplest explanation. Unfortunately for Charlotte, coincidence had already ended the night she shared her dinner. Deep beneath the Cedar Estate, hidden below levels of modern architecture that no public blueprint acknowledged, a circular chamber slowly filled with members of the oldest vampire houses in North America. Ancient portraits lined the stone walls, each depicting generations of leaders who had guarded the same promise for centuries. Raphael Morello stood before them in complete silence until every conversation disappeared. His calm presence commanded attention more effectively than raised voices ever could. An elder stepped forward holding a weathered leather ledger whose pages had yellowed with age. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "the archives have confirmed what many believed impossible." Raphael accepted the book without looking away from the council. "Say it." The elder lowered his head. "No human has freely offered food to a reigning vampire king without seeking favor, wealth, protection, or recognition in over 200 years. The chamber became perfectly still. Another elder quietly added, "The Covenant recognizes such an act as a gift of grace." Raphael closed the ledger. "The Covenant also demands restraint." "It does," the elder agreed, "but eventually she must know the truth." Raphael remained silent for several moments before answering. "She will learn when knowledge becomes a gift instead of a burden." No one challenged the decision. They understood their king better than anyone. He had never feared revealing himself. He feared taking away an ordinary life that someone still treasured. The following Saturday, Charlotte accepted only a half shift at the diner before spending the afternoon volunteering at a neighborhood food pantry, something she tried to do once every month whenever her schedule allowed. She unpacked canned goods, organized shelves, and greeted every visitor with the same gentle warmth she offered customers at the diner. An elderly volunteer watched her help a nervous teenager choose groceries for his younger siblings and quietly smiled. "You always treat people like neighbors," the woman said. Charlotte shrugged modestly. "Most people are just having a harder day than we realize." Outside the building, several unfamiliar black vehicles remained parked along the opposite side of the street. None displayed company logos, none attracted attention. Inside each sat quiet observers dressed in ordinary clothing, blending naturally into the weekend traffic. They watched only to ensure Charlotte remained safe without ever realizing she was being protected. One younger observer spoke softly into a discreet radio. Subject continues normal activities, no direct contact. The response came only seconds later. Maintain distance. His Majesty's instructions remain unchanged. As evening settled across Portland, Charlotte finished organizing the last donation boxes before locking the pantry entrance. She stepped outside, carrying her backpack, and breathed in the cool air with quiet satisfaction. The volunteer coordinator called after her. "Thank you again, Charlotte." She smiled. "I will see you next month." Halfway down the sidewalk, she noticed a familiar figure standing beside the small public garden across the street. Raphael was watching the sunset rather than the passing traffic. Charlotte crossed the intersection before she had time to question the decision. "Either this city is much smaller than I thought," she said with a light laugh, "or you somehow know exactly where I keep ending up." Raphael turned toward her with the same composed expression she had begun to recognize. "Perhaps kindness has predictable destinations." She smiled at the unusual answer. "That sounds like something from an old novel." Sometimes old novels remember truths modern people forget. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The evening breeze stirred the leaves overhead while children laughed half somewhere beyond the park. Charlotte finally looked directly at him. "You know my name. I still do not know yours." Raphael held her gaze with quiet sincerity. "My name is Raphael." She extended her hand without hesitation. "It is nice to meet you properly." He accepted the handshake with respectful gentleness, and for the first time since they met, Charlotte noticed something impossible. His hand was cool despite the warmth of the evening, and around them every bird in the small garden had suddenly fallen silent. As though the entire park had paused to witness a meeting far more important than either of them yet understood. Charlotte Hayes walked home beneath a sky painted in shades of amber and blue, replaying the brief handshake in the park. Raphael had been polite, thoughtful, and strangely different from anyone she had ever met. There was an old-fashioned grace in the way he spoke, as though every word had been carefully chosen long before it reached his lips. His hand had been unexpectedly cool, but she dismissed the detail as nothing more than the evening breeze. By the time she reached her apartment, she had convinced herself that she had finally made an unusual new acquaintance and nothing more. Across the city, Raphael returned to the Cedar estate without speaking during the drive. The quiet inside the vehicle was interrupted only by the soft hum of the tires against the pavement. His closest advisor sat across from him, patiently waiting until the gates closed behind them before asking the question that had lingered throughout the evening. "She knows your name now," Raphael nodded once. "She does. Does that change anything?" Raphael looked through the window toward the dark silhouettes of the cedar trees. "It changes only one thing. She is no longer simply someone I observed. She is someone I have met." The advisor understood the difference. Observation required distance. A meeting created responsibility. Inside the estate, several senior members of the council were already waiting. Maps, handwritten records, and carefully preserved journals rested across a long oak table. One elder opened a weathered volume and carefully turned to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "Your Majesty, the oldest covenant remains clear. A gift of grace establishes a sacred debt." Raphael rested both hands lightly on the back of a chair. "I know the covenant. Then eventually the debt must be honored openly." Eventually, Raphael agreed. Not for she is ready. No one argued further. They had followed Raphael for generations because he never confused patience with hesitation. The next morning, Charlotte arrived at the diner before sunrise. Rain clouds drifted slowly across the city, promising another wet afternoon. The breakfast rush began almost immediately, filling every booth with familiar conversations and the comforting sounds of clinking dishes and fresh coffee being poured. Around mid-morning, a delivery driver entered carrying several heavy boxes that had been addressed to the diner. Charlotte offered to help him carry them inside before returning to her tables. As she finished organizing silverware, the owner approached holding a small envelope. "This was left for you," he said. "No return address." Charlotte looked surprised. She thanked him and carefully opened the envelope during her short break. Inside was a simple cream-colored card. There was no signature. Only a single sentence written in elegant handwriting. "Thank you for reminding someone that kindness still exists." Charlotte read the sentence twice before quietly placing the card beside the folded note already tucked inside her wallet. She smiled without fully understanding why the message felt so personal. She assumed another anonymous act of gratitude had found its way to her. She never imagined the words had been written by the same man she had met beside the park only hours earlier. Late that afternoon, rain finally arrived. Charlotte stood beneath the awning outside the diner, waiting for the storm to ease before walking to the bus stop. Across the street, she noticed Raphael standing beneath another awning, apparently caught in the same rainstorm. This time, neither of them crossed immediately. They simply exchanged small smiles from opposite sides of the street as passing cars sprayed water across the pavement between them. For a brief moment, the busy intersection seemed unusually quiet despite the traffic. Charlotte lifted one hand in a friendly wave. Raphael answered with the same gentle gesture. The traffic light changed and several buses rolled between them. When the view finally cleared, Raphael was gone once again. Charlotte laughed softly to herself. Somehow he always seemed to appear and disappear like a character stepping out of an old story. She turned toward her arriving bus without realizing that, less than a block away, dozens of discreet guardians quietly watched the ordinary exchange with visible relief. Their king had finally allowed himself to become part of one human life, yet he had done so with remarkable restraint, preserving the simple kindness that had first brought their paths together. Charlotte Hayes began noticing small changes that were difficult to explain once she started looking for them. They were never dramatic enough to frighten her, only unusual enough to linger in her thoughts after the moment had passed. The bus she usually missed somehow waited an extra few seconds whenever she ran late. An elderly customer who had forgotten his medicine discovered it neatly placed beside his coffee before anyone admitted seeing who had returned it. During another afternoon at the diner, a little boy wandered away from his parents for only a minute before a calm stranger gently guided him back with quiet reassurance. Each event seemed ordinary by itself. Together, they formed a quiet pattern that Charlotte could not quite understand. She mentioned it one evening while closing the diner with her manager. "Does it ever feel like people have been unusually kind lately?" she asked while stacking clean plates. He smiled without looking up from the register. "Maybe kindness is contagious," Charlotte laughed softly. "I hope you are right." She carried those words with her as she stepped outside beneath a sky filled with slow-moving grey clouds. Across the city, Rafael Morello stood inside the highest room of the Cedar Estate, where enormous windows overlooked miles of evergreen forest stretching toward the distant mountains. Several trusted advisors waited respectfully nearby. One of them quietly placed another report on the polished oak table. "The protective circle continues without incident," he reported. "No member has broken your instructions. The human remains unaware." Raphael read only the final page before closing the folder. "She should remain unaware for as long as possible." Another advisor spoke carefully. "Some among the houses believe the time has come to formally recognize the gift of grace." Raphael walked toward the window. His reflection appeared almost transparent against the evening light. Recognition should honor the giver, not burden her. "And if she discovers the truth herself?" the advisor asked. Raphael remained silent for several moments before answering. "Then she deserves honesty." The conversation ended there. Everyone present understood that day was drawing closer. The following Saturday, Charlotte decided to spend her afternoon at the neighborhood farmers market. Fresh flowers lined the sidewalks beside local bakeries and handmade craft booths. Musicians played soft acoustic songs while families wandered between colorful tents. Charlotte sampled homemade jam, purchased a small bundle of fresh herbs, and stopped beside a local bakery displaying warm sourdough loaves. As she reached for one, another hand reached toward the same loaf. She looked up and smiled. Raphael quietly withdrew his hand first. "You saw it before I did." Charlotte laughed. "You can have it if you really wanted this one." He gently shook his head. "Please, bread seems to find its proper owner." The unexpected reply made her smile even wider. "You really do speak differently from everyone else. Is that a complaint?" "Not at all." They walked together through the market for several minutes, never rushing the conversation. Charlotte spoke about the diner, her favorite recipes, and how she hoped to save enough money one day to open a small cafe where nobody felt unwelcome. Raphael listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions but never interrupting. She noticed how naturally people stepped aside as he approached, almost without realizing they had done so. No one appeared frightened. They simply made room, as though responding to an invisible sense of quiet respect. Charlotte found the detail curious but said nothing. As they reached the edge of the market, church bells echoed across the neighborhood. Raphael paused beside a row of flowering dogwood trees. "May I ask you something?" he said. "Of course. When you gave your dinner to a stranger that night, what did you expect in return?" Charlotte looked genuinely surprised by the question. "Nothing, not even gratitude." She smiled and looked toward the families filling the park. "If someone is hungry, eating is enough. They do not owe me anything after that." Raphael lowered his eyes for the briefest moment, as though the answer carried far more weight than she could possibly imagine. Charlotte noticed the expression but could not understand it. Before she could ask another question, a line of identical black vehicles quietly rolled past the market entrance several blocks away. Every passenger looked forward without speaking, yet each vehicle slowed ever so slightly as it passed. Charlotte barely noticed them, Raphael did. For the first time since they had met, he realized that the quiet promise to keep two worlds apart could not last forever, because hundreds of ancient eyes had already begun looking toward the same ordinary woman who still believed she was living an ordinary life. Charlotte Hayes spent the next week wondering why conversations with Raphael felt so effortless. They had met only a handful of times, yet speaking with him carried none of the awkwardness she usually felt around strangers. He never rushed her thoughts, never interrupted, and somehow always remembered the smallest details she mentioned. During one quiet afternoon break at the diner, she caught herself smiling while rereading the handwritten note still tucked safely inside her wallet. She quickly folded it away before anyone noticed. Outside, autumn clouds drifted slowly across the Portland skyline, casting gentle shadows over streets that had become increasingly familiar to Raphael. Unlike centuries spent hidden behind stone walls and carefully guarded traditions, these ordinary sidewalks offered something he had almost forgotten existed. Children laughed without fear. Neighbors greeted one another by name. Complete strangers held doors open simply because someone else was approaching. Watching Charlotte move naturally through that world reminded him why the ancient covenant had valued simple human kindness above displays of power. At the Cedar estate, however, patience was beginning to wear thin. Representatives from several vampire houses gathered once more inside the council chamber. Their voices remained respectful, but concern could no longer be hidden. One elder carefully unfolded a document preserved for generations. "Your Majesty, every house has honored your command. No one has revealed our existence, yet questions continue growing." Raphael remained calm, "Then answer them with patience." Another elder lowered his head before speaking. "Many believe silence dishonors the gift of grace itself." Raphael studied the weathered parchment before responding. "Recognition given too early becomes a burden instead of gratitude. She deserves neither fear nor unwanted attention." A long silence followed before the eldest council member slowly nodded. "Then perhaps the time has come for a different form of gratitude." Raphael looked toward him with quiet curiosity. "Explain. Invite her as an honored guest to the Foundation Gala. She will believe it is a charitable event. The houses will simply observe from a respectful distance. No declarations, no revelations, only gratitude." Raphael considered the proposal far longer than anyone expected. Finally he answered, "If she accepts, she will be treated exactly like every other honored guest. No ceremony, no special attention." Every elder agreed without hesitation. It was the first step anyone had been permitted to take. 2 days later, Charlotte finished another busy lunch shift and discovered a cream-colored envelope waiting beside the employee's schedule. Her manager smiled as he handed it over. "Looks important." Charlotte examined the elegant seal before opening it carefully. Inside rested an invitation to an annual charity gala supporting community food programs across Oregon. The event would be hosted by the Morello Foundation. Beneath the invitation, a handwritten note appeared in the same familiar style she had seen before. "We hope you will allow us to thank someone who has quietly helped many people." Charlotte blinked in surprise. She had never heard of the foundation, yet the invitation felt sincere rather than extravagant. Later that evening, she searched online and discovered photographs of hospitals, scholarship programs, neighborhood kitchens, and disaster relief projects carrying the same foundation name. There were surprisingly few photographs of its founder. Most articles described Raphael Morello as a private philanthropist whose interviews were almost non-existent. Charlotte stared quietly at one small photograph showing the same thoughtful expression she already recognized. "So that is where you disappear to?" she whispered with an amused smile. She accepted the invitation without realizing that preparations across another hidden world immediately began shifting into motion. Tailors prepared formal attire. Security teams reviewed every detail. Ancient families adjusted travel plans that had remained unchanged for decades. Yet none of those arrangements centered on politics or ceremony. They centered on ensuring that one ordinary waitress would experience a beautiful evening without ever feeling out of place. Charlotte closed her laptop, placed the invitation beside her recipe book, and wondered whether she even owned a dress suitable for such an event, never imagining that her quiet decision to attend would bring her one step closer to understanding why meeting Raphael had never been an accident at all. Charlotte Hayes almost declined the invitation 3 different times before the evening finally arrived. Standing inside her small apartment, she looked at the simple navy blue dress she had borrowed from a co-worker and smiled at how unfamiliar the entire situation felt. Charity galas belonged to magazines and television programs, not to waitresses who counted grocery coupons before payday. Even so, something about the invitation felt sincere. It did not promise luxury or recognition. It simply invited her to celebrate people who quietly helped others. That idea alone was enough to convince her to go. The event occupied the grand ballroom of a beautifully restored historic hotel overlooking the Willamette River. Warm lights shimmered across crystal chandeliers while a string quartet filled the room with gentle music. Volunteers, teachers, firefighters, nurses, and community leaders mingled comfortably together. Charlotte immediately noticed that the atmosphere felt surprisingly relaxed. No one seemed interested in status. Conversations centered on neighborhoods, schools, shelters, and families instead of business deals or social influence. She finally relaxed and accepted a glass of sparkling water before slowly exploring the room. Unknown to every human guest present, nearly half the elegantly dressed attendees belonged to ancient vampire houses. They blended naturally into the celebration, speaking politely with donors and volunteers, while carefully honoring Raphael's single instruction. Charlotte Hayes was to be treated exactly like every other guest. No ceremonies, no whispered attention. No one would approach her unless she chose to begin the conversation herself. Raphael watched quietly from the far side of the ballroom, greeting foundation partners with calm professionalism. To everyone else, he appeared to be nothing more than the reserved chairman of a remarkably generous charitable organization. Only the oldest members of the hidden community understood the deeper significance of the evening. For the first time in centuries, their king had invited the giver of a gift of grace into his world without asking her to carry its weight. Charlotte wandered toward an exhibition displaying photographs from community kitchens, scholarship programs, emergency shelters, and food banks supported by the Morello Foundation. She stopped in front of one picture serving hot meals after a devastating winter storm. A familiar voice spoke gently beside her. That kitchen remained open for 17 straight days. She turned and smiled. "Raphael," he returned the smile with quiet warmth. "I am glad you came." They walked together through the gallery at an unhurried pace. Raphael explained how local volunteers often accomplished far more than generous donations alone. Charlotte listened with genuine admiration. "You never told me your foundation did all of this." "The work matters more than the name attached to it," he answered. She looked around the ballroom once again. "Everyone here seems peaceful." Raphael followed her gaze. "People who spend their lives helping others often recognize one another without introductions." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense." Across the room, several distinguished guests subtly inclined their heads toward Raphael as he passed. Charlotte noticed the respectful gestures but assumed they reflected his position within the foundation. What she did not realize was that each greeting carried traditions older than the nation itself. An elderly woman with silver hair quietly approached Charlotte, holding a small porcelain plate of desserts. "Miss Hayes," she said warmly, "everyone has been hoping to meet the young woman who never expects applause." Charlotte looked surprised. "I do not think we have met." The woman smiled kindly. "Not until tonight." Before Charlotte could ask another question, the evening's master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the annual celebration of everyday compassion. Instead of recognizing wealthy donors first, he invited volunteers, teachers, caregivers, and community workers to stand. The ballroom filled with heartfelt applause. Charlotte remained seated until Raphael quietly looked toward her. "You belong with them." She hesitated before slowly rising alongside hundreds of others who had quietly served their communities without seeking recognition. The applause that followed was warm, genuine, and shared equally among them all. Charlotte felt unexpectedly moved, not because anyone knew her name, but because kindness itself had become the guest of honor. As the applause gradually faded, she looked toward Raphael once more and noticed something she had never seen before. Every person in the ballroom, no matter where they stood, instinctively waited for him to move before resuming their own conversations. It happened so naturally that almost no one seemed aware of it. Charlotte could not explain why. But in that quiet moment, she finally understood that Raphael was far more than the generous founder of a charitable organization, even if she still had no idea just how extraordinary his true place in the world really was. Charlotte Hayes remained thoughtful long after the applause faded and the evening settled into quiet conversations around the ballroom. She stood beside one of the tall windows overlooking the river, watching city lights shimmer across the water while trying to understand the feeling that had followed her throughout the night. Nothing about the event had been extravagant for the sake of appearances. Every story she had heard centered on people helping neighbors, rebuilding communities, or feeding families who had fallen on difficult times. Somehow Raphael had built an entire foundation around the same simple belief that had guided her own life. He joined her a few moments later, carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water. "I thought you might like a break from introductions," he said with a gentle smile. Charlotte accepted the glass gratefully. "Thank you. I still cannot believe this entire evening exists because people decided kindness deserved a celebration." Raphael looked across the ballroom, where volunteers continued laughing together without concern for titles or recognition. Kindness deserves more celebrations than history has given it. Charlotte studied him for a quiet moment. "You speak as though you have watched history for a very long time." A faint smile crossed his face, but he did not answer immediately. "Sometimes it feels that way." Before she could ask another question, the chairman of the evening stepped onto the stage once more. "Before we conclude tonight," he announced, "our founder would like to recognize one guest whose actions reminded all of us why this foundation was created." Charlotte instinctively looked around the room, assuming someone extraordinary was about to be honored. Raphael remained beside her, perfectly calm. "Please do not worry," he said softly. "This is not what you think," the chairman continued. "Several weeks ago, one ordinary act of compassion reached someone who needed to remember that generosity still exists without expectation. The recipient asked for only one thing, that the person responsible never be embarrassed, never be placed above others, and never feel obligated to carry attention she did not seek." Charlotte listened politely, unaware that every respectful eye in the ballroom had already turned gently toward her without staring. "Miss Charlotte Hayes," the chairman said warmly, "would you please join us for just a moment?" Her eyes widened with genuine surprise. She glanced toward Raphael almost instinctively. He offered only a reassuring nod. Slowly she walked to the stage, feeling far more nervous than honored. The chairman welcomed her with a kind smile instead of dramatic ceremony. "We are not recognizing wealth, achievement, or influence tonight," he said. "We are recognizing a simple decision made on an ordinary rainy evening when someone chose compassion without expecting thanks." He presented Charlotte with a small handcrafted wooden box rather than a trophy. Inside rested a silver bookmark engraved with a short sentence. "Kindness given freely changes more lives than the giver will ever know." Charlotte's eyes softened as she read the words. "I do not know what to say," she admitted quietly. The chairman smiled. "Then simply continue being yourself." Gentle applause filled the ballroom once again. It felt warm rather than overwhelming. No one rushed forward. No cameras surrounded her. She returned to Raphael carrying the small box with both hands. "I still do not understand," she confessed. Raphael looked at the engraved bookmark before meeting her eyes. "One evening you offered your last meal to someone who appeared to have nothing." Charlotte nodded slowly. "Yes, that person happened to be me." She smiled, relieved that at least one mystery had finally been answered. "Then I suppose this is your way of saying thank you." Raphael's expression became quietly sincere. "It is one small part of it." Charlotte searched his face, noticing once again how every person nearby seemed to treat him with effortless respect. This time she decided to ask the question directly. "Raphael, who are you?" He remained silent for a moment before answering with complete honesty. "I lead a community that has remained hidden from the world for generations. The people you met tonight are part of that community. They wished to thank the woman who reminded their leader what kindness truly looks like." Charlotte absorbed his words carefully. They sounded extraordinary, yet the quiet sincerity in his voice left no room for mockery or performance. Instead of fear, she felt only curiosity. She looked around the ballroom once more and suddenly understood why every guest had treated Raphael with such remarkable respect from the moment she arrived. Whatever responsibilities he carried, they had never changed the gentle man she first met beneath a rainy bus shelter. As the evening came to a close, Charlotte slipped the silver bookmark inside the second-hand cookbook she had purchased weeks earlier, smiling as she realized that the smallest decision of her life had quietly connected two very different worlds through nothing more complicated than an ordinary act of kindness. Several weeks passed after the charity gala, and life gradually settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and quietly transformed. Charlotte Hayes still woke before sunrise, still rode the same city bus to the neighborhood diner, and still greeted every customer with the same gentle smile that had always come naturally to her. Yet something inside her had changed. She no longer believed that small acts of kindness disappeared unnoticed into the world. Somewhere beyond the ordinary streets she walked each day existed people whose lives had been touched by choices so simple that she had almost forgotten making them. The realization did not make her feel important. It made her feel responsible in the most hopeful way. She understood that compassion was never wasted. Across the city, the Cedar Estate returned to its peaceful silence. The ancient council gathered one final time beneath the high stone ceiling where generations of leaders had once debated matters hidden from human history. This meeting was different. There were no disagreements and no uncertainty. The eldest member slowly closed the weathered covenant ledger before looking toward Raphael Morello. "Your Majesty, the sacred debt has been fulfilled with honor." Raphael nodded quietly. "Not because it was required," he answered, "but because gratitude deserves action." Around the chamber, every representative of the ancient houses lowered their heads in agreement. The lesson they would carry home was not about tradition or authority. It was about remembering that even the oldest community could still learn from the simplest human heart. From that day forward, the gift of grace became more than an ancient phrase preserved inside forgotten books. It became a living reminder shared across every house that kindness freely given should always be protected, never exploited. Charlotte never learned every secret of Raphael's hidden community, nor did she ask to. She respected that some responsibilities belonged to worlds she had not lived within. Raphael, in return, never asked her to become someone different. He never tried to pull her away from the life she loved or surround her with unnecessary privilege. Instead, he quietly strengthened the causes that already mattered to her. The neighborhood food pantry received enough support to remain open throughout the entire year. The diner where Charlotte worked began partnering with local shelters so that unused meals reached families who needed them instead of being discarded. Scholarships appeared for students pursuing careers in community service, always funded anonymously through the Morello Foundation. Charlotte noticed the improvements one by one without immediately realizing who stood behind many of them. One crisp autumn afternoon, months after the rainy evening that had first connected their paths, Raphael visited the diner during a quiet hour between lunch and dinner. He chose the same corner booth where sunlight spilled softly across the table. Charlotte carried over a fresh cup of coffee before sitting across from him during her short break. "You know," she said with a warm smile, "I finally finished every recipe in that old cookbook." Raphael smiled in return. "Which one became your favorite?" She laughed gently. "The simplest soup in the entire book. Why that one?" Charlotte looked out the window where people hurried along the sidewalk beneath golden leaves drifting through the afternoon air, because it reminded me that ordinary things become memorable when they are shared. Raphael followed her gaze before answering quietly. "That is true of meals. It is also true of lives." Neither of them spoke for several peaceful moments. There was no need to fill the silence. It carried comfort rather than distance. When Charlotte's break ended, she stood and gathered the empty coffee cup. "Thank you," she said. Raphael looked up with genuine curiosity. "For what?" She smiled exactly as she had on the rainy night they first met. "For reminding me that kindness really does come back, even if it takes a different path than we expect." Raphael stood as well. "No, Charlotte. Thank you for reminding an old soul that kindness never left the world at all." As evening settled over Portland, Charlotte locked the diner after another ordinary shift and stepped onto the sidewalk carrying a simple paper bag holding her dinner. At the nearby bus shelter, she noticed a tired traveler studying an empty vending machine with quiet disappointment. Without hesitation, she walked over, placed the paper bag gently into the stranger's hands, wished them a peaceful evening, and boarded her arriving bus with nothing except a smile. Across the street, Raphael watched from a respectful distance before quietly turning away, knowing there was nothing more he needed to protect than the beautiful truth he had witnessed from the very beginning. The city lights reflected across rain-soaked pavement exactly as they had on the night they first met. But this time Charlotte was no longer walking through a world that ignored her kindness. She had simply discovered what had always been true. Every sincere act of compassion sends its own light into the darkness, and sooner or later that light always finds its way home.